the majority of our life is lived in liminal space.
And there's this in-between space, this liminal space.
This liminality that reveals possibility.
I think we're in a liminal moment, but also in a place of transformation.
I have great affection for the church and a troubled relationship with it.
Just to be alive in time means that we're on the threshold of the future.
That can't be the gospel, because God said to love our neighbors.
We don't know what the future looks like. We have to work it out together.
You probably didn't know that I was an angler myself. I was a fisherman. I was really good at putting the bobber and the worm on my hook, standing on the shore and fishing. I was probably the best shore fisher that there was in my whole family. I would be able to break in those bluegills like nobody else. And I would go out early with my dad on Saturdays, and we'd drive from Redford all the way over to Kensington Park, and we would go to Proud Lake and all that. We would fish, and I remember the McDonald's breakfast on the way. You know, it's the weird things you remember. I don't remember any of the fish stories. I remember the McDonald's breakfast because I was never awake at that time to go get McDonald's. McDonald's was always Happy Meals for me. So it was different, you know, a different thing. And I'd get that big styrofoam plate with the pancakes in it. You remember that? Do they still do that? I don't do fast food anymore, but that's what I remember that part. But also, once a year, my grandma, I named her after her dog, Charlie. She was Grandma Charlie, because I had to figure out which grandma are we talking about. Is it the one with Charlie, the dog, or Candy with the dog? So I had Grandma Charlie and Grandma Candy. And Grandma Charlie, also Grandma Rita was her real name. But Grandma Charlie would take me and my cousin Mike up to Gladwin every year for a week's stay on a lake at a family friend's house. I don't remember who they are. I just remember it was Pat and Chuck's. And it was fun. And I loved going. And me and my cousin would just fish. And this one time, we decided to do some trolling. I didn't know what that was. That was new. I was a shore fisherman. But like, no, we're going to get in the rowboat and we're just going to row around the lake. And you just cast your rod out there and see what happens. And so, you know, lakes are all like weedy and stuff. And so we would be going and then all of a sudden be like, oh, I'm caught on something. And, you know, we'd have to row to the weeds and I'm winding it up as we go. And then you untangle it and you keep going. And we caught a couple of crappie, you know, they're like bluegill and stuff. And so we caught some crappie and it was fun. We had a lot of fun. Here's actually a picture of me, the great angler. My cousin actually just sent me these pictures. So that was me after I shaved yesterday. No, that's what I look like when I shave. Yep, there's a little crappie I got, or that might be a perch or something, but that's up at Pat and Chuck's. And so we're just angling around up there, fishing off the dock and doing the trolling and whatnot. And we got a couple of crappies and everything. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, we're caught on a weed again. What are we going to do? Caught on a weed. It's like, well, go back to the weed and I'll start reeling it in as we go. And then all of a sudden this fish jumps out of the water. And I'm like, that's not a weed, that's a fish. Now I'm a 10-year-old seeing a fish like leap out of the water like that. And I'm like, this is like what they do on TV. This is great. So we're reeling it in, and I can't pull on it because the guy is just so big. And we ended up getting all the way there, and we pull him into the boat, and he's the biggest crappie I've ever seen in my life. A lot of people have fish stories, and they like magnify the fish stories, and you're like, yeah, but how big was it really? I actually have a picture. Like, it was huge. So that was the crappie I caught. Looks like a bass. I don't know how, we didn't weigh it. I didn't have any like weights or anything. Normally they're the size of bluegill and whatnot, but he's just huge fish. And all the neighbors were coming by to see how big this fish was. And we put him on that, you know, the gill hooks and whatnot. You can carry around a whole bunch of fish by their gills and whatnot. And I left it in the water so that it wouldn't, die totally. And I came back the next day and some turtle like ate all the fish. They were gone. So I did get some pictures of it before, the turtle stole them from me. a jerk, but when I think of fishing and when I think of boats, I have this recreational view of it. I have McDonald's breakfast and Pat and Chuck's house and Proud Lake and my dad and bobbers and hooks and worms and all that kind of stuff and hobbyist fishing, weekend warrior kind of stuff. The more serious fishermen, the more expensive the gear, they get up there with boats and trolling motors and tackles and stuff like that. Some are just like pole and bobber fishers, and that's fine. They do it from shore. Some fly fish in a stream. Some have this, large, huge bass boats, and they got to catch those fish because they're fast, I guess. I'm not sure, but, they cruise across the lakes. And I'm more of the hobbyist guy. I've done it a couple of times with my son. Last year we went out fishing and everything. It was fun. But I have these memories, summarizing those, camping trips. And we go out to Canada, and my great grandfather, Grandpa Zoller, had a cottage up there, and there was a pond at the end of the drive. And I'd walk down there and I'd fish at the pond by myself and all that kind of stuff. So when we hear that Jesus is hanging out with fishermen, like my immediate response is to think of all of these things, tackle boxes and, hobbyists and recreationists and having fun out on the lake and all that kind of stuff. And that's actually not what it is at all. They're not hobbyists out there just trying to catch a fish for fun. It's their occupation, and it's what they do for a living. So when we talk about fishing in boats and by the Sea of Galilee and all this kind of stuff, I gotta exit my brain from that hobbyist fishing thing, and I gotta jump into more of commercial fishers on coastal towns. Like those cool UK detective videos or doctor shows, and they're on coastal cities and they're quirky personalities and all that kind of stuff. You got to think more of like commercial fishermen that live on coastal towns, like Maine lobster fishers or oyster fishermen, or, down in Florida, you got the people. I don't know what they do down there. I don't know. They catch fish with things, I think, but commercial fishermen on coastal towns. This is what we got to put our brain in to kind of understand the context of this verse and these passages where Jesus is calling disciples to himself. So if we can get out of the mindset of, this kind of fishing, having fun, hanging out kind of a stuff, and being like, this is a serious occupation. These are like blue collar workers, like that lower middle class, upper middle class area, somewhere in there. That's what they're doing. That's their job. They're tradesmen. It's like an electrician or a plumber or, someone, or a cook or a server or something like that. They're just people earning their living on the road. So this passage here, where it opens up, not with fishermen, but it kind of gives us that runway to get there. Jesus is withdrawing for some reason. He says, I need to get out of here. He says, I got to get off into the wilderness because I heard that John the Baptist was arrested. Now, this is the very human side of Jesus right now. Jesus was fully human and fully divine, according to the doctrine of the incarnation. It's a mystery. I don't know how it works, but this is the very human side of Jesus. If you think of Jesus as like an X-Men superhero with all these like magical powers and stuff, you got to get your brain out of that mode and get it into, he was just a regular guy that God was strongly with. Like that's how the scriptures portray him. Then there's all these theologies and doctrines that develop later on that help us understand what that meant. But in these passages, he's a guy. He heard that John the Baptist, who happens to be his cousin, by the way, was arrested by Herod the Great. Or Herod Antipas. So he has got to withdraw, and he goes to Galilee, and he made his home there in Capernaum by the sea. So that what may be spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. And there's that passage there, land of Zebulun and Naphtali. Those are interesting city names. There's some fun stuff going on in this passage. There's some fun stuff. But do you mind if I nerd out for a minute? Just a small minute. I like to nerd about stuff. Just a little bit. Have you ever thought, like, what is time? Only I think of stuff like this, right? Like, what is time? How do you measure it? You're like, well, I'll get out my stop clock or my phone, and it keeps track of time. Well, how does that know how much time passes? And the interesting thing about time is that early in human civilization, the sun and moon was the primary clock and calendar. Like we have, watches, or we have phones, or we have clocks on the wall and all this other stuff. They didn't exist for a while. It was just like they had the sun and the moon, and that was about it. There was 12 hours in a day. There was 12 hours in a night. And it didn't matter where the sun was on the horizon. We technically only have about 9.5 hours of daylight. They would just say it's 12. Even though they knew it was longer at certain periods, they would just divide up that 12 into different watches of the night. First watch, second watch, third watch, fourth watch. So it wasn't very precise, was it? Like, you're not going to be able to like get out your sundial and then see who's the winner of the race, who is the fastest. It's like, how are you going to really like precisely measure that kind of stuff with a sundial? It didn't. But keeping track of seconds wasn't really very important to those people. What was very important to those people were the seasons of growing and harvesting and storing food, as well as worship and prayer and being in community. So their understanding of time was very seasonal, very local, and very communal. And keeping track of seconds and minutes wasn't really that important. So a fun way to think about this is, any gardeners or farmers in the house, maybe you've heard the phrase, when the maple leaves are as big as a squirrel's ear, it's time to plant the corn. I've heard that growing up. Like, when the maple leaves on the tree are about the size of a squirrel's ear, you can go plant your corn. Like, that's the kind of time that they keep. It's not like, well, on April 13th, as long as, at 4:32 p.m., you can start planting the corn. It's like, no, let's go look at it's very seasonal understanding of time. Go look at the trees. What do the leaves look like? Is it ready yet? But precision in timekeeping was not necessity. Rhythm was. They had to know, when is it safe to plant? When should we be harvesting? When should we be storing? When should we be hibernating? Like, when it's 25 below zero outside, a great time to hibernate. Time was not really that precise. It didn't matter if it had precision. But as we expanded, precision became more necessary. And minutes and seconds were more like, astronomers used minutes and seconds because they wanted to like clock how the stars moved. And minutes and seconds were not something that you really like watched and like kept track of. It was more of mathematical theory for a long time. But it was only for nerds. It was still very, rhythm was more important than precision. But then in the 1600s, as humans were navigating oceans, and seconds are mattering more because you don't want to wind up off course by miles because you missed something by a few seconds. So the expansion of human empires with coordinated militaries, with trade routes, that required more precision than moon cycles are going to show. More precision than just kind of like, well, the sun rises and sets kind of a thing. And then the 19th century rolls around, and the railroads are coming to town. And you got to know, like, what time does the railroad come into town? All of a sudden, minutes and seconds become even more important. And so precision starts to be more important because you got to know when it's going to depart, when it's going to arrive. If you want to visit the family, you can't be late for your train. It's not a clock. Like a system of gears was then invented. And they're like, we got to know, like, precision, how to keep time, how to keep track. And we got to make sure that we're keeping the same time as other folks around the country that we're connected to with all of these rail systems. But still, that was not precise enough for science. When milliseconds became important in the 1950s, when they're trying to measure down to the millisecond and sometimes even nanosecond for their scientific experiments, precision became very essential. So in 1955, this guy named Louis Ascend, he developed an atomic clock for microsecond accuracy that was needed for experiments and spaceflight and satellite orbits and all that kind of stuff. Like, that was really, and that atomic clocks, they don't measure the time based on where we're at around the sun or how the sun rises. It's like vibrating atoms. How fast does a atom vibrate between, one another? And I don't know all the science of that, but it doesn't change. And so atomic clocks are the most precise clocks in the world because that vibration of atoms doesn't change. So astronomical time, actually, the time that we use, like the sun, it needs adjustment every year. Ever heard of a leap year? Right? Like it's not 365 days on the dot. And then like, all right, let's go another time around. Like every 4 years, we got to add another day to February because it's really more like 364 and a quarter days. So it's not as precise as that. But did you also know that they have to add leap seconds to our year? Every now and then, our clocks are just not on with things, so they have to add a leap second every now and then. And we really don't catch it because nobody's watching the seconds. But they've added about, I think, 15 to 20 leap seconds since they realized they need to do it in the 1970s. So that's the thing. The sun is not as precise as like atoms and things. And so when it says that Jesus withdraws, what does timekeeping have to do with John the Baptist getting imprisoned and Jesus withdrawing into Galilee to escape Herod? What in the world does time have to do with that? Time is a system, right? We create a system to keep time so that we know when does church start? When is we supposed to be over at a family's house for dinner? All this, when do we got to be at the train station or the airport? Time is a system that's natural, that's necessary for human organization, but it's also imperfect and needs correction. Even time itself needs an added leap day or a leap second added to the leap year, right? Time is a system that helps organize us and it helps control us. But as you can see, no system is perfect. And even our clocks need adjustment. So time is a system, but we also have things called social systems that help organize us. Historically, we've made them to help govern ourselves, economically organize ourselves, build communities around shared values and goals. We all live inside of a social system. But how do we recalibrate our social systems when they're off? What happens to a system that needs to change because those at the fringes are being harmed by the system in place, but those at the top are benefiting from its maintenance? This is the role of the prophet in the Bible. Those who demand change are then persecuted. And this is the role of the prophet, to stand at the edges of the systems that people live inside of with an objective view, and then to speak truth for change in a way that helps people, especially those on the margins and those at the edges of the system. That's what prophets do in the Bible. So why does power react so violently when the prophet demands a change? John the Baptist told Herod, like, hey, you're not in line with what ought to be happening. He took his brother's wife. He's like, that's not cool, yo. That's Hebrew idiom. It's a Hebrew idiom. And so Herod can either acknowledge that and change, or he can use his power for his own benefit and persecute John. He chooses to persecute John, has John arrested. So John's at the edge of the system. He's out in the wilderness. He's literally at the edge. He's looking in and saying, that's messed up. And then he tells Herod, hey, that's messed up. And then Herod is like, I don't like when you tell me it's messed up. I'm going to put you in jail. So he goes to jail. So a workshop is a system also. It's designed to make things. I'm working on my workshop. I'm building a wood shop in my barn. It's been on hold because it's so cold, but I'm going to get around to finishing it. But a workshop is a system. You organize your tools and your projects in certain orders that help you create. And how you organize yourself is very important. The system you create to organize yourself is important. But what happens when an organized system becomes static, becomes sacred? You don't touch it. You don't mention it. It then turns into a museum of how things used to work, but no longer. And a workshop is for creativity, but museums are for seeing how things were in the past, but please don't touch. And when a system is a workshop and an organized system and it's for creativity and building, it's good. And when a system becomes static, it turns into that status quo maintenance system that provides stability and structure for a certain amount of people. So it's fiercely defended even when it ceases to work for people. And when a leader absorbs the benefits in such a way that it creates great suffering on the margins, the truth is going to disrupt things and must be suppressed. This is why prophets are killed in the Bible all the time. Read 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It happens over and over and over again. And John the Baptist steps in to this prophetic tradition, does the same thing. He's in prison. Later, he is beheaded. So the leader who absorbs the benefits and comforts loses touch of those that it was absorbed from, and then becomes violently defensive and or recklessly offensive as they seek to maintain that power and status quo. And when that person becomes in love with the power of the position more than the people it serves, you have a problem that needs a prophet. And a prophet has to step in and say something very true and sometimes very hard. And Herod Antipas was such a leader. He was mentioned, he's not really mentioned in our text so much. He's the guy that got John imprisoned. But he inherited that position from his father, Herod the Great. We talked about him a couple weeks ago. But when a leader loves the power more than the people, the system stops serving life and starts protecting the system. And so prophets are needed. Prophets, there's always folks on the fringe of a system that we create that notice the inevitable suffering and exclusion the farther you get from the centers of its power. These folks have traditionally been called prophets in religious circles. A prophet is not one who foresees the future. That's like in a lot of movies and stuff, prophecy is like, I have seen the future kind of a thing. Most of the prophets from the Old Testament are just, they're not seeing the future. They're seeing very clearly the present moment and its effects. And then taps those people in power on the shoulder and says, excuse me, but these folks over here, sir. That's what prophets do. And today they have different names: artists, writers, poets, activists, musicians. And not all people with those labels are prophets, but prophets are found among these groups more often. And John the Baptist was one such prophet, out in the desert, doing his own thing, creating his own community. And we can see that when he speaks truth, power does not like the prophet. That's clear in the Old Testament. A king would establish actual prophets who would tell him all he wanted to hear and then exile or kill the ones who spoke the truth. Those are called the false prophets in book of 1st, 2nd Kings and Chronicles, and sometimes Samuel's. The king would say, I don't want to hear the truth. I want to have all these prophets here. You'll come in, you'll be my homeboys, and you just tell me I'm doing great stuff. And don't tell me anything else. That's your job. Just tell me I'm doing it great and don't say anything else. That was the job of the false prophet. And God doesn't like them very much because they tell lies. And so this King Herod, he has John silenced in order to maintain his own power. John was a victim of this dynamic in our passage, the dynamic between a system that is not serving the people. He then calls it out and then is imprisoned. That system is on replay throughout all of human history. But Herod uses his power to pursue John and imprison him. And our text says, when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. Now, Jesus doesn't go right up to Herod, look him in the eye and say, I'm about to knock you silly, man. Like, get in line. He actually just withdraws. He moves away. And that move that he does isn't just a geographical move. He's actually doing something very strategic. He withdraws from where Herod Antipas has a lot of say and power over him to a place where he has less say and power over him. And he withdraws not to hide, not to be safe. He withdraws to gather something. He's going to start a different movement. He knows that God's light is like the stars. They're like steady, they're consistent, they're beautiful. But man, if you go into downtown Lansing and look at the sky, you're not going to see that many, because the centers of human power centers, they have so much artificial light that you can't see the natural beauty of the sky. But then you get to a dark park or your backyard out in the country or somewhere else, and you can see the stars and they're beautiful. And the light that humans create, like, it's functional, it works, but it hides the true light of God oftentimes. And so Jesus withdraws here, not to retreat and say, I'm in trouble, I better hide. He withdraws to do something different, to then gather together a group of people called some fishermen. Jesus takes off from Nazareth. He heads to Galilee and finds refuge on the north side of the Sea of Galilee in Capernaum. And it mentions this geography not for geography's sake, but for theological and narrative sakes. The two towns mentioned here, Zebulun and Naphtali, I have no idea if that's how you pronounce it. I was just told to say it with confidence, and then people don't question it. So you hear me saying them, it's like, I don't know if that's what they're really called. But Zebulun and Naphtali, these are the names. They're not names of villains from Ghostbusters, by the way. They're just like, it's not like this. Sorry, that's a joke. There are two regions in the northwest Israel area with some really age-old history to it. So the story goes here, the story of these two towns is that King Solomon, like the king that inherited the kingdom from King David, who slayed Goliath. King Solomon, he was the one to build the temple. Now, other than that, it was just a big tent, and people worshipped in a tent. It was called the tabernacle. And Solomon's like, I'm building this great, big, massive brick temple. So that's what he wanted to do. So Solomon does that, and he gives these two towns, these two regions to Hiram, which was the king of Tyre, as a payment for labor and supplies that he sent that was used for the building of the great temple that replaced the tabernacle of Moses in the 900s or so. So he used labor and supplies from these areas and then gave these two towns to the king as a thank you. What's really interesting is that these people were outsiders called Gentiles. And these Gentiles were not allowed to worship in the temple because they weren't Hebrew people. And so Gentiles, outsiders, helped build the very worship center that defined who was in and who was out, who was clean and who was unclean, who was fit for worship, who was excluded, even though they themselves would not be included in the definitions of belonging to the system that they built themselves with their hands. Interesting history there, isn't it? Zebulun and Naphtali, the people who built the temple, but then were not allowed inside of it. The people who worked and bled and they worked hard, y'all, to build this thing. And then they're like, thank you very much. We'll give your king 2 cities as a thank you. And now you can go away. So they were merely used and discarded and given the door prize for participation. And that's it. And I find it interesting that these folks who are sitting in what's socially defined darkness of the day are the ones who are the outsiders that are now seeing the light. The land of Zebulun and Naphtali, you have seen a great light. This is really interesting that Jesus and Matthew keeps doing this. Like kings from the east come and recognize the Christ child and say, this is the king. While all of Jerusalem is afraid that this king is born and might steal the throne from Herod. Insiders are afraid of God. Outsiders are coming to welcome him in. This is a pattern that we see in Matthew over and over and over again. And so I find it interesting that those who are in darkness, being labeled outsiders, is where God's light starts to shine. Not the holy temple, not the professional priests, not the established king, not the educated scribes, not the aristocratic Sadducees, not the moralistic Pharisees, not the zealots who love war, not the ascends who are out in their solitude. None of these socially defined as insiders is the source of the light. It's these outsiders, the ones who are actually sitting in the dark while God is more active than ever, probably because of their proximity to the power structures of the day, namely King Herod, who wishes to put a stop to the actions of God by imprisoning John the Baptist. So I like what Justo Gonzalez, he's a historian, a church historian. He said, Christianity was born not among the powerful, but among those who had little stake in the existing order. He's an evangelical Bible scholar, by the way. And Christianity as an organized religion is just as in need of prophetic critique as ancient Judaism, Babylonian warlording, or the Roman imperialism, all those bad guys from the Bible. And anywhere humans organize themselves, there's a danger of becoming a closed system inoculated from external input. So truth is often found not in centers of power, but in the margins amongst the people, the neighborhoods, and communities that we live in. Historically, Christianity blossoms where folks have nothing left to lose. So God withdraws to the margins in this story to start a movement where despair has set in. So if you're feeling despair, if you're feeling apathy, fear, anxiety, anger, indignation, you're actually closer to seeing God's light than if you were in comfortable seats of power and palaces of influence. That's what this story tells me. Like, when you are in that mode, who you give permission to shape your imagination during those times is crucial. And we have to look to the prophets, not the propagandists. So his next section, he's walking by the Sea of Galilee. He calls these fishermen. Here's Jesus on the margin, gathering these outcasts. The interesting thing is, like, boats of this story are commercial fishing boats with large handmade nets used for catching schools of fish to sell in the markets, right? In 1986, they actually found one. They excavated it. There it is. Now, a modern theologian put together what this would look like in modern day times. There's what the boat would have looked like, something along those lines. They're about the size of a small camper. So here is a boat that is not hobbyists, but professional working fishermen. Jesus calls professional working fishermen to come be his disciples. This is a grand reversal that just happened. This is a radical passage. A rabbi is supposed to sit back in his little comfy chair and say, all the students, come seek me out. And I'll choose you, and I'll choose you, and I'll choose you. The rest of you go away. Like, that's how it worked. And so you worked. If you dropped out of the system, if you weren't chosen, if you didn't make it all the way through the education place, then you would just then take up a trade like building or fishing or farming or weaving. So the fact that these disciples are fishermen tell us that they didn't make it far enough in their schooling to be a disciple. And here Jesus then goes out and he's like, I want to pick some working class folk. I don't want a bunch of people with a whole bunch of fancy information in their brains already. Like, I'm just going to pick some regular old Joes. Like, we're going to hang out. They just got enrolled into seminary is what we hear. Like, that's just what happened. So their father would not have, like, he was not going to look at them and be like, oh, these crazy kids, they're just leaving the family business and going off with this. Their father would have been like, holy smokes, I got to run back to tell the whole town about this. Like, my sons were just chosen to be disciples of a rabbi, and they would run back. But those who were told they were not good enough are now being bearers of a divine mission. It starts among the people of the margins, not the people at the top and at the center. That's where the movements happen. I like this. Jesus created a community defined not by blood or status, but by response to God's call. That's by E.P. Sanders, a historian. The fact that Jesus did something so radical shows that he is decentralizing the centers of power of his day. You're not in the club just mere because you have the right ethnicity or economic status or education level or religious affiliation or geographical location. None of that mattered to Jesus. There's just open invitation of participation. And the disciples said yes. The light was best seen in small communities of ordinary folks gathered around tables and not temples. And when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, as Jesus predicted, there was already a new movement in motion called the church. We can see that story in the book of Acts. This movement, these verses are the first steps of that movement that happened. It says that he went through all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, curing all these diseases and sicknesses amongst the people. And I don't know if you're like me, but I like to focus in on the action of healing here. And then I wonder, like, if that miraculous event still happens today. It's a modern question of an ancient text that's natural for us to ask. But before we get there, we need to ask, what's the author doing? Before we ask our modern questions of it, ask ourselves, what is the author trying to do and say? And then we can get to there. And I think the author wants us to focus on how God has come near, how God is found among those that society has labeled cursed. Like, disease and sickness were often interpreted in this day as signs of God's condemnation. So this is a theological statement before it's a metaphysical statement about what God can and can't do. But to take on the question, do miracles still happen? The answer is yes. But often Christians claim to it as a birthright. Like, oh, miracles have to happen to me because I'm a part of this thing. And they can treat people with disabilities or terminal illnesses without dignity, reducing them to a prayer request that will prove that their theology is correct. But here, Jesus is standing in solidarity with these people. So healing is not proof of correct theology. It's an act of solidarity that says God is with them. That's what Matthew is primarily trying to get us to see. God is with them. And God's solidarity with the crucified is the ultimate source of hope for us regular old folks sitting in the pew. That's from James Cone, one of my favorite theologians. When the church finds itself on the side of those dealing out suffering in the world, we find ourselves in opposition to God. Justice is not a tool wielded by God's wrath that the church gets to play with. It's the fruit of love cultivated in community for the community. So the call to repent, for the kingdom of God is near, was a call for them to untether themselves from the power structures of the world and step into solidarity, community, and care with those in their neighborhoods. This light we cannot see can reshape our imagination, because what we imagine shapes how we hope. And what we hope for, who we hope in, and how we work to bring about that hope, it's the most important function of the mind, your imagination. So don't surrender that on over to worldly powers. Offer that imagination to God's love and put it to work here in this community. That's what we're trying to do. And that's why we taste a little bit different when you walk through the door of this church. So here's some questions to think about. What forms of darkness feel most present in your life right now? Where has survival become so important that you've stopped imagining transformation? If Jesus called you in the middle of your work, what would you be most afraid to leave unfinished? And here's a practice you can try, a spiritual practice. It's very simple. Before bed or before work, when it's dark outside, sit in a darkened room with a candle in silence. Don't try and make it do anything. Don't try and think about anything. Just sit in the darkness with a candle. That's it. Give it a try.